Hello and welcome back to Bad Comic Review. Today we're talking about Ectokid, issue 1. This is part of the Razorline series, characters created by Clive Barker, not written by Clive Barker, created by Clive Barker. And this is labeled as a tale of the Barkerverse. They don't call it that anymore, and I think they dropped that after a few issues. But this is actually written by James Robinson, with pencils by Steve Scroce, inks by Bob Dovrak, sorry Bob, colors by John Caliz, letters by somebody whose name I can't read, might be Gregor, editor by Mark McLaren, consulting editor Malcolm Smith, editor-in-chief Carl Potts, and Tom DeFalco. Alright, so we start out with a kid running and people chasing him. On the second page we get 2-page spread, pages 2 and 3, of those people turning into weird monsters. Now, the first page, I thought, well, this art looks kinda crappy. And then when you turn the page, everything's all distorted and weird and exaggerated. It kind of works for the book. And it's not my favorite art, and it's definitely not art I particularly care about. It's average, passable, but kind of mid-range to low range. And there's a reason for that. Now, this book came out during the height of the comics boom, and things were starting to decline right about this time. And this series actually became a victim of the comic boom and bust. You'll notice when you pick this one up that it has a foil embossed cover and a $250 cover price. $250 was ridiculously high for that time. In '93, that was exorbitant, but Marvel was not doing well financially, and they were pulling out all these gimmicks to try and get an extra buck. And it worked for a little while. Unfortunately for this book, by the time this came around, people were getting sick of paying 2, 3, 4 times the price for one book with a supposedly special cover, and it was a speculator market. The real collectors got sick of it because they saw it as a sign of garbage, and usually they were right. Usually they had second, third-rate writers and artists on the books. This one actually has James Robinson, so it's pretty impressive. It's a sign of the times. Now they have lenticular covers to try and entice people. Back then they did the foil embossing. Although these were not variants, these were the regular issues. So you didn't have the option. Anyway, we pick up with Dex Mungo. Yeah, his name's Mungo. Dex Mungo, who's a petty thief. He's robbing some hotels, stealing shoes and wallets when he meets 3 lovely ladies, and these women actually are very attractive in the book, who lure him into a room with temptations of the adult nature, and then he lays down as they're touching and kissing him, and he opens his eyes and sees these freakish, distorted monsters. It's a full-page thing. It's a really cool shot with these creepy looking people, and he of course freaks out and starts running away, and the girls chase him out of the room and orders some men to follow him, and that's who's been chasing him. We get a really good chase scene where he's running around in this weird nightmare world, slides under a carriage, and he's trying to escape these freakish monsters, and he's saved by somebody with an exaggerated nose and a couple of swords, who of course is actually named Cyrano. So good job. Then we learn that there are 2 people, Ice and Tom Augustine. They're brothers, literally from other mothers, and they were both born a few seconds apart, and their mothers both died, and they had the same father. So they were raised by their father, who was apparently a violent sociopath, taught them to, and I'm quoting here, to settle arguments with a shotgun or claw hammer, how to gut a man for looking at them wrong, and how to make wonderful sherry sauce for chicken. But that's another story. End quote. And apparently the one is not very bright, Tom. He's apparently a big dummy dumb. So he's possessed by the spirit of a woman named Catherine Monvision, who was a witch and killer during Louis XIV's reign. And her spirit was trying to orchestrate the whole thing to capture Tom Mungo, because his mother is some sort of psychic who has access to what they're calling the Ectoshphere, which is this freaky alternate world that he was in. The kid's terrified, so he's hiding out, and they're going to kill him. And that's the entire story for issue 1. It's very action-packed, very good pacing. There's a lot going on, and it doesn't screw around. It gets right to it, not a lot of time wasting. There's also a backup story called Have You Heard the One About Felon Bale? And that is a lead-in to Hokum and Hex issue 1, which we will look at in a different episode. And it's kind of a semi-pointless story where it's just kind of world building a little bit. I don't think you need to read that to understand what's going on in Hokum and Hex, but it's a nice addition. So it's a normal size comic. It wasn't worth the $2.50 of the time. Maybe 75 cents or $1, but I don't think that the foil embossed cover was actually a very good selling point. It looks pretty, don't get me wrong, but I can see why a lot of people didn't buy it. I had actually purchased this years and years ago when it first came out, and I may have read it once back then, but I don't remember ever reading it again. But it was a big deal because of the foil embossing, and it's in issue 1, so the speculator market went nuts for it. Overall, it's in 50-cent and dollar bins all over the place nowadays. If you pay more than $2 for it, you're wasting your money. It's an okay issue. It's an interesting start to the series, and I'm intrigued to see where it goes, but overall, it's not James Robinson's best work, but it's far from the worst thing I've ever read, so it's pretty middle of the road. But that'll do it for this one. I do like the cover, especially because it is foil embossed. You get a little bit of weirdness around it, and the foil embossing does work for it. You know, if you're paying $1 or so for it. If you're paying more than $2, don't bother. But that'll do it for this one. As always, thanks for listening, and we hope to see you on the next episode. Hello and welcome to another Bad Comic Review. Today we are looking at Ectokid issue 2. This is from Marvel's Razorline imprint, which are all characters created by Clive Barker. And this one is done by the same team as last time. We've got James Robinson writing, Steve Scocci penciler, Bob Dvorak inker, Gaspar letterer, John Clazis colorist, Mark McLaren editor, and on. Tom DeFalco was editor-in-chief at the time. Anyway, we open with a preview of what's coming up, as usual, sort of cliffhanger thing. Dex Mungo is facing off with some weird-looking monster thing. Alright, that's not really the crux of the story. The story is actually a lot of character building. We've got Dex hiding out at like an apartment of some kind, and he's made it back, obviously, to this apartment. He's trying to figure out if he inherited his mother's madness, but he figures out that his eyes, which I didn't realize were two different colors, one eye lets him see into the Ectoshphere, which is where people go when they die, and the other eye sees our reality. So in order to figure out what's going on, he has to go talk to his mother. And to do this, he goes to see Bales, a lawyer that was retained to be his guardian. And Bales likes to paint horror action figures or models of some kind. He likes to do these, so it's an interesting character trait. I'm pretty sure that guy will come back up later. But he already signed over the permission slip to go see his mother, and it's the only way he's going to get in. Even Bales doesn't know who hired him to be the guardian. Unsure of whether or not he should actually go see his mother, he goes to talk to 3 of his friends. A bartender guy, some wise old lady who looks like a voodoo priestess, and a stripper of some sort. And they all kind of give him similar advice. You know, it's at some point you're going to have to do this. So he goes to the hospital and he takes a peek at it with his one eye, which he's wearing an eye patch over, and sees it through the Ectosphere and sees these horrible pterodactyl things. So he covers his eye back up and goes in. He's led down some creepy hallway. New Orleans, everything about it is creepy, so this is not real surprising. And he sees his mother. As soon as he mentions that he's having visions, she snaps out of her listlessness and starts talking to him. She is apparently really heavily involved in the occult, including like making spells and potions and things. During that time, she summoned a man back from the dead, and they fell in love. That's how he was conceived. So he is the product of a dead man and his living mother, and that's why he can see into the Ectosphere. That's when he also learns out about the Etherites. They're sort of ghost police that came and got his dad and dragged him back. And she explains to him how he can meditate and leave his body, because when he looks through at the Ectosphere with his eye, he goes to the Ectosphere even though he's alive. So he actually is in physical danger. But he can leave his body and explore that way. But that leaves his body open to being possessed. Also, his father created a device called the Aurat, A-U-R-A-T, and that's something that can help him in some way, and he hid it, and he didn't want anyone to have it. And that's obviously important because some bad people wanted it, and that's why they're after him. They're after Dex, I should say. Turns out that this machine was built before his father died, and that's why he died, was he was murdered by these bad people that wanted it. And his name is Leo Melhart. Dex hugs his mother and tells her that he's gonna go, and she says, when you find him, tell him I still love him. When Dex is on his way out, he meets a creepy looking priest that says, hey, why don't we have a talk about your mother in a quieter place? If a priest tells you to go to a quieter place and it's a dark place, don't go there. No, that's obviously bad things are going to happen to you. And of course they do. This priest is a demon, a rogue demon, and that's the creature that he was fighting on the first 2 pages there. And Dex was lucky enough to glance with his ecto eye and see what was going on. And there's a pretty decent little fight. Dex gets thrown down the stairs, hurts his shoulder, but manages to pull out a boot knife, stab the thing, and then burn it with some hot cinders from a fire. And that's basically the crux of what's really going on. But then we follow up with the 2 assassins that are after him and follow them around. They've killed everybody that was in the bar, everybody that was hanging out with the stripper, even though the stripper's hair is a different color now. And they find the priest. They don't show the old lady, but I think it's fairly implied that she's dead too. Yeah, but Dex is on his way to find his father, so he's in the Ectosphere on the last page. And it gives a little caption that says, into the Ectosphere, next issue. This issue was a lot of fun, actually. It was a lot of character building and story building, but it was incredibly well paced. It's another great book by James Robinson. I honestly did not like this book when I was younger, but as an adult looking back on it, I have to say it wasn't bad. It was actually pretty well written. It was a very fast paced, fun story, and I'm not normally into a lot of the supernatural comics because usually they're not very good, but this one was really well done, and I'm intrigued to read issue 3. I'm kind of surprised based on this that this didn't get better coverage. I think the cover price of $1.75 really hurt this book because that is significantly more than most comics were at the time. So I think that's its major flaw. Otherwise, the art's pretty good. It's okay. It's not the greatest. There are pages where I don't care for it and the detailing's a little off, but when they do a good job, they do a good job. It has a very surreal feel to it, and I really like that. So be sure to check it out. The cover's misleading, but it's a good issue, and I recommend it. Go check it out. It's easy to track down online. It's not an expensive book. So that'll do it for this one. As always, thanks for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you on the next episode. Hello and welcome to another Bad Comic Review. Today I am looking at Ectokid issue 3. Now we're picking up where we left off. This is another issue written by James Robinson and the same team from previously, from what I can tell. Dex is in the Ectosphere and he's walking around, and he's yanked off the street by a guy named Jindrak, who warns him that there are spies for La Voisin, the old witch of Louis XIV's court, having to run to escape her, and they manage to get to a house where Jindrak has been living. And Jindrak's not his real name. His real name is James Nigel, and he's a friend of Dex's father. Well, he sends for some other allies, including Edgar Allan Poe and Cyrano de Bergerac. There's a few other guys. One's like a wizard who uses magic brought over from Africa, a sailor who's a tough guy, but there's also a traitor among them. And before long, they are being swarmed by these monsters, led by La Voisin. Her name is actually spelled 2 different ways in this book. Once on page 16 is Voisin, and then previously on page 7, her name is spelled Voisin. So there's some discrepancy in the pronunciation for me. So I'm not even sure how it's actually pronounced. But they managed to flee from the monsters, fighting their whole way up to the roof. And there's an awesome 2-page spread of them being surrounded by these demons, and they're doing a pretty good job. These demons were summoned by this witch, and they're called Expurgatorius, which are like summoned monsters. And just when things look like they're going poorly, they're losing friends left and right. There's a bright flash of light, and who should arrive but the Etherites, the Ectosphere, like, pseudo-police enforcers. And they came out of a hole in the sky. So there's a lot more to the Ectosphere than they've told us so far. But we don't know what happens because it ends on this cliffhanger. It's really, actually, very interesting. The world building in this is pretty fascinating. The Ectosphere is an interesting concept, but it's not a boring issue. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of like there's this letter that Dex's father wrote to him that thereafter, because I think it's supposed to reveal, well, they seem to think it reveals the location of his machine, but Dex is trying to find out more about his dad, and they're really advancing the storyline. It's a very action-packed issue. It's a good issue. It's not the best thing I've ever read, but it's definitely action-oriented, and it's not bad. I didn't see any swearing, as long as you don't mind, spiritual realms and ghosts and magic and that sort of thing. It's not a bad book. I've definitely read worse. It's worth picking up for a buck or two. But yeah, this story's still pretty good. I'm intrigued to see where it goes. It looks like everybody may have been zapped away, but obviously there's something else going on. So yeah, it looks like the book's going along pretty well, and I'm definitely saying that if you're interested in supernatural horror, this is a pretty fun book. Probably not for everyone, but I'm not sure why it got canceled as quickly as it did. So far, it seems pretty good. So yeah, I'm going to put that in the recommend list. That'll do it for this one. As always, thanks for listening, and we hope to see you on the next episode. Hello and welcome to another Bad Comic Review. Today we are looking at Ectokid issue 4. This book had a $1.75 cover price, which was very expensive for the time. I don't know if this issue was worth it or not, but it's an interesting story. We pick up where we left off, but this time with a different creative team. This time the story is by Larry Wachowski, art by Steve Scocci and Bob Dorvac, colors by Mike Thomas, editor Mark McLaren, and letters by Gasper. So James Robinson's not on the book anymore, and quite honestly it shows. It's not a horrible story by any stretch of the imagination. I've read way worse, but it's definitely weaker than the previous issues. So when last we left Dex Mungo, he was possibly obliterated in the Ectoshphere by the Etherites. Well, in this issue we learned, in fact, that he was ejected from the Ectoshphere and tossed back into his own body. He also learns that he can control ectoplasm. I don't know if he's generating it, that's a little unclear, but it's not really delved into in this issue. All we know is that he can control it somehow. Well, the brothers Augustine are shown back up, Ice and Tom, and they have finally tracked down Dex's mom, and they're going to take her along with some creepy little guy that's like the sinister version of Danny DeVito, who claims he's a certifiable physician. They kill a few orderlies, and Tom apparently has a similar power to Dex in that he can see ghosts. And he talks to the ghost of the doctor briefly. Dex is off trying to find out what's going on. He looks for his friends, and the bar that he was at is trashed. There's lots of cops around. He has to sneak into the building and finds all these body outlines. And he runs into the stripper, Angela, whose ghost tells him what happened, and then she is taken to the Ectosphere by the Etherites after he leaves. So he knows that they're after his mother, and that Angela told them where his mother was. Dex goes in there to stop them. The ghost of the doctor tries to stop him. That doesn't work, of course. And Dex is able to knock down the big guy with his ectoplasm once, but they get away with his mom, leaving him with a sort of video phone that's really huge. Modern smartphone is significantly smaller, but this is the 90s. So they tell him that he's got to go find the machine for them, or they're going to kill his mother. And that's where the issue ends. It's not a bad story. It's just kind of middle of the road. It's an interesting plot. It's just not as well executed as I think it could have been. And it's a definite step down from the previous issue. I'm not sure why James Robinson is not on the book anymore at this point. That may be lost to the sands of time, but it's definitely a noticeable change of pace the way the storytelling is done. So I didn't hate the issue. It was just kind of middle of the road. A little forgettable, but it is driving the plot along. It just feels a little bit forced. I'm not sure who this writer is. I'm not familiar with the name. Larry Wachowski is not somebody whose name I remember off the top of my head. He was probably one of the freelancers or fill-ins that they had at Marvel at the time. But he's got some talent. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with the issue. It's not James Robinson's work, and it's not somebody on his level. This is definitely a step down, and I'm starting to wonder why they continued with a $1.75 price point when they weren't working with top talent. The artist is fine, but it wasn't somebody that you really had heard of that you're going to run out and pick up the book for either. And I don't particularly like the cover. I think Dex looks really weird. It's not a scene that's actually really in the issue. He's not green. When he comes back from the Ectosphere, he's in regular color. And that scene is actually kind of neat how he merges with his body. So yeah, don't care for the cover too much. I think it's kind of a silly image to have on the cover, and the story was a little tepid but not awful. The letter from his dad was incredibly disappointing. It just made a Bob Dylan reference and told him where to meet him. It didn't do anything beyond that. It wasn't a big reveal, which they kind of built it up to be kind of a big reveal. So it was a little disappointing on that front too. But overall, kind of a middle of the road episode. Hopefully next issue will be better. So we'll see in the next time we review Ectokid if the next issue is better than this one. Until then, as always, thank you so much for listening and supporting the channel. And be sure and hit like, subscribe, all that. And hopefully we'll see you on the next episode. Hello and welcome to another Bad Comic Review. Today we are looking at Ectokid issue 5. This is part 1 of a 2-part crossover story with Saint Sinner. Part 2 is in Saint Sinner issue 5, which we'll be looking at next. This is Sir Sigmund's Arcadia. And as you can tell from the cover, it's about an arcade with a demon. So we pick up where Saint Sinner issue 4 ended with an explosion near a little car. And that was Phil crashing into the Ectosphere, and he meets up with some kids that are going to a carnival. Then we jump back over to Dex Mungo, and we have this very elaborate story of him and how he excretes his ectoplasmic form so that he can travel to the Ectosphere, and it comes out of his left eye, which is kind of gross. But that's the eye with which he can see the Ectosphere. So the swirling mass of ectoplasm takes his form, and he can see into the Ectosphere by going through doorways then. And he sees a sign going to Highway 61, and attached to it is a little handbill for Sir Sigmund's Traveling Arcadia. And there's a drawing of a worm on there that starts talking to him, and the worm comes to life and hops in his ear and takes control over him and forces him to go to the Arcadia. Now, Dex goes, he's not exactly fighting, and there's a busty blue lady at the door, but as soon as he passes her, behind him, you can see that it's really some monster that is hungering for him. And there's all sorts of strange creatures here, but at any rate, when he gets to a gun range where they're shooting at these little ghosts in what looks like a fake cemetery, that's where he meets Phil, who is doing really well at this game, shooting these little ghosts. Well, the ghost tries to give him a heads up that he is in fact a kid just like them, telling people to run and all that, but nobody pays any attention to the little ghost. So they miss an early warning sign, but that's where we meet this rather husky demon fellow, Sir Sigmund. He is a large demon thing that is like the ringmaster. The worm, named Tequila, ironically, jumps out of Dex's ear and into the guy's shirt pocket, and we learn that people have to pay coins to play the games. So what happens is people summon some ectoplasm, and this guy, Sir Sigmund, takes the coins, seems to be really obsessed with them. So Phil and Dex take their hands at the shooting range, and they mow down a bunch of these little ghost creatures, even though one of them is begging for mercy. And that causes some kind of flashback, because the guy says, "I'm praying to you," and it causes a little flashback for Phil, where he remembers killing all his friends, and it seems to make him lose the game. But they don't think much of it, and they go on a roller coaster ride, and that's when they kind of have a little get to know you moment, and they talk about music, and it's really dated because they talk about Sonic Youth, Pearl Jam, Chili Peppers, Rage Against the Machine, Ministry. Those are all bands that most modern readers have never heard of, so it really dates the book there. But the cars get diverted off the main track and crash into a dead end where they are attacked by some henchmen of Sir Sigmund. And it turns out these coins are something that Sir Sigmund eats to maintain his long life and the taste of the living, as it were. Dex figures out that he can trick the creature, so he gives him a whole bunch of ectoplasm coins, and while the gluttonous demon eats them up, Dex summons them all back to him because he can see that the creature hasn't digested them, so he still can feel them. And he uses that as a way to get the ectoplasm to bring the keys to Phil, and they unlock themselves and escape. But the demon is not dead, and is hungry for revenge. So that's where it ends and crosses over into Saint Sinner 5. Now, this issue was written by Larry Wachowski with pencils by Steve Scroce. I don't particularly care for Scroce's art that much. It's okay. The Ectosphere parts is definitely better because it's supposed to be very surreal, but I don't know. He does really well on people, I think, but it's not as detailed as it probably should be. And the story was fine. It was okay. So it's a pretty mediocre issue, but it's definitely better than a lot of the Saint Sinner stuff we've been looking at, which I have to say I don't think is Eileen Lee's fault, but we'll get into more of that when we look at some other issues of that. Hopefully it gets better. But yeah, this was a pretty middle of the road issue. This book really went downhill after James Robinson left, but this story was okay. So I'm interested to see how it concludes, and for that you'll have to tune in the next episode. Otherwise, yeah, the cover's okay, but that's really about everything about it was pretty mediocre. So that'll do it for this one. As always, thank you for supporting the channel by viewing, and please hit like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you on the next episode. Well, hello, and welcome to another Bad Comic Review. Today, we are looking at Ectokid issue 6. This is obviously a Clive Barker book under the Razorline imprint. And we start off with Dex reminiscing. His head is disembodied and floating around, and he is having little flashbacks of somebody going through a windshield, some monster thing. Then, we see various other little doodads and whatnots, as the kids would say. Well, he did find his father in this issue. He appeared at Highway 61, and he was with some other people. He was driving an old VW bus. Dex is remembering all this as he's trying to put himself back together. So who is he with? He is with, of course, it's a weird assortment of celebrities throughout the ages. Jindrak is there, who looks different, but it's not explained. Then he meets Janis Joplin, James Dean, and then we've got Nicola Sacco and Bartolome Vanzetti. They were anarchists in America who were convicted of murdering a guard and a paymaster. They had robbed a place in Massachusetts, the Slater and Morrill Shoe Company in Braintree, Massachusetts. And they were put to death in the electric chair at Charleston State Prison. And since they were violent anarchists, they had sworn to do violence against the government and wage war. And this was back in 1921, I believe. The other guy that's there is Fred Hampton, the Black Panther activist and revolutionary from the 1960s. Yeah, it's an interesting assortment, but it's a pretty good issue. We've got what is effectively just a car chase scene throughout the issue. Dex and his dad have a hug moment before they're on the road, and they're tailed by a guy named Grudge, who has a grudge. Yeah, Grunge has a grudge. Figure that one out. So the guy's like a loan shark. Leo, Dex's dad, owes him his soul. And that's when we find out that ectoplasm can be used to craft things in the ectosphere. It's a form of energy, so you can create almost anything. And Leo's a little disappointed that his son hasn't figured that out by now. But that's when things get all fast and furious, and the anarchists throw a big roll of dynamite out and blow up one of the cars. We see that Grunge can somehow talk to the kid. Janis Joplin hands him this big jug, and he drinks it, and he says, "I remember the taste of Janis Joplin's soul." Then she just throws it out the back of the door for some reason. Just shatters it on the ground. Never to be explained or talked about again. Then there's some gunfighting, and they blow up some more stuff. They get to a bridge. The guy tells Dex that, he has to get to the RAT. That's where his body is. They didn't realize that it was inside of his guitar case in the trunk of the car. Now, when they showed this machine previously, it looked like this big, huge, room-sized piece of equipment with monitors and stuff, so now it's just some tiny thing. So there's James Dean doesn't back down when driving. He ain't no chicken. So there's a big headlong crash, which is where we got the previous scene that he had flashback on. And then the ecto dynamite explodes and makes Dex fall apart into pieces, but since you can't destroy ectoplasm the same way you can destroy flesh, so that means he's still alive, so he can recreate himself out of ectoplasm or track it down, and it's a little unclear which he did. And then he sends himself back to the real world, where there's a sweet leather jacket waiting for him. Now, I have to say, this was actually a pretty good issue overall. Minus some stupid elements like this constant need for throwing in weird celebrities. It wasn't bad. This was edited by Tom DeFalco, writer was Larry Wachowski, pencils by Steve Scroce, inks by Bob Dvorak, and colors by Mike Thomas. Letters by Gasper again. So the art's actually pretty good. I didn't have a problem with that. A lot of the celebrity people didn't really look like who they are supposed to look like. Like we got generic adventure guy, Jimmy Dean, not the sausage guy, but James Dean. Angry black man who's supposed to be Fred Hampton, but he doesn't look like Fred Hampton. He looks more like Fred Williamson. And then we've got Janis Joplin, who looks like the Joker and Janis Joplin had a kid together. Although the two Italian guys do kind of look like they're sketchy ancient mugshots. So overall, we learned that ectoplasm can be used like the Green Lantern ring is about all I really got out of this issue, but the chase sequence was pretty good. This was definitely one of the better issues in the series, in my opinion. You don't get a lot of resolution, but it is an interesting setup. Still, the story is definitely lagging, and it's not the strongest work that Marvel produced at the time, which is not saying a lot because they didn't produce a whole lot of really good material at this time. I don't think I would have been happy if I had paid $1.75 for it off the newsstand, because it's not that good. It's more the dollar range. But if you see it in a 50-cent bin, and this one, and it's definitely a two-parter. This was an okay issue, but I don't think that it's not the worst issue in the series, but it's not as good as it could have been. But the action scenes were pretty cool. It's really well drawn, so I'm not upset about that at all. So yeah, kind of a middle of the road issue, much like a lot of them in this series. But that'll do it for this one. I don't really have much more to say. I do like the cover, even though that scene doesn't appear, by the way. Thanks as always for listening, and we hope to see you on the next episode. Hello and welcome to another Bad Comic Review. Today we are looking at Ectokid issue 7. This is by the same team as last time, and it is of course part of the Razorline imprint from Marvel, which are superheroes from the mind of Clive Barker, as the tagline says. Well, we pick up where we left off. Ice and Tom still have Dex's mom. He has found out where his father's machine is, and he's going to trade that knowledge for his mother. Well, they decide to dress his mother up like a nun and shave her head, put her in various torture positions, all the while talking to Dex. Now, Dex is annoyed. Ice is ordering him around, but Dex does the silly screw loose thing, and Dex points his gun at the camera, but Dex shuts his camera off and Ice blows his apart. Okay, then we cut over to the General, who is a member of this secret organization called the Expurgatorius, which is who Ice and Tom are working for. And the General's having a dream that he's got the Auret and he's raising an undead army to kill a sinister-looking Saddam Hussein, then the Russians, and then the world, all on a giant risk board. It's actually kind of funny. So then we learn that the Cardinal, who is the leader of this Expurgatorius group, is waiting for the general to arrive, and he is with the senator and a guy called the Manipulator, who's a TV talk show host. And once they're all together, the Cardinal tells them that at midnight they will have the device. Well, at 1 second after 12, Ice and Tom are still waiting for Dex to show up. Well, Dex is called the Ectokid for a reason. He shows up to St. Louis Cemetery in New Orleans in ecto form. So because he's in ghost form, only Tom can see him, and Tom's a little slow. Feeling double-crossed, Ice is about to take sinister action upon Dex's mother with his gun, and Dex does what any smart ghost would do. He jumps into Ice's body and tries to possess him. Well, that doesn't quite work out, but he's able to get some control. Tom gets freaked out because the other ghosts start swirling around, the ones that are haunting the cemetery, and he takes off running. Well, Ice has managed to get some strength together and point a gun, but so has Dex, and he puts a gun to Ice's head. And it ends right there with Ice saying, "You gotta be kidding me," as he's got a gun to his own head and to Dex's mom. So we're going to get some resolution next episode, or next issue rather. But overall, it was a really fun issue. It was actually probably the best one in the series. So I'm intrigued to see what issue 8 brings, because it's obviously the series only lasted 9 issues, plus the attempted reboot later on. So this storyline's going to be wrapping up, and they were just kind of hitting their stride when the book got canceled. That's how it looks to me. But we'll find out with issue 8. Otherwise, this was actually a pretty solid issue. I don't know if I would recommend the whole series yet. I'm going to reserve that judgment until I'm done with issue 9. But yeah, this was actually probably the best issue in the series so far. So not bad. Not James Robinson's work, but definitely the best one that was by these guys, and Wachowski's best work on the series so far. So that'll do it for this one. As always, thanks for listening, and we hope to see you on the next episode. Hello and welcome to another Bad Comic Review. This time we're looking at Ectokid issue 8, and we pick up where we left off in issue 7 with the standoff inside of Ice Augustine's body, where Dex is trying to possess him, but not doing a real good job. Ice has a gun pointed to Dex's mom's head, and to his own head. Unfortunately, Dex can't maintain the ability, and he drips out like ectoplasm. But Ice Augustine can see him now because they've exchanged parts of their soul, I guess. And with Dex out, he's not able to stop Ice. He's only able to keep Ice from killing his mother. Ice wanders off, and Dex's mom manages to take him to a safe house, which apparently is a family-owned closed business, where she extracts this portion of Ice from him and puts it in a bowl, but it quickly becomes a hand and attacks Dex, and knocking him around because they're both ecto form. But it also allows Ice to track them, and Ice shows up, guns blazing, but Dex's mom comes out, and she's in this awesome, like, angelic battle armor, which actually looks really cool, I thought. And she's able to restrain Ice with ectoplasmic tendrils, and that gives Dex time to pull out the remaining piece of his ectoplasm, because if you lose too much ectoplasm, you cease to exist. Once that's recovered, unfortunately, Ice is able to get his gun, and he guns down Josephine. Dex has to watch his mother be killed because he's still in ecto form, and he's able to speak to his mother's spirit briefly before Theriites come and take her to the other side. And she tells him that they're not the enemy, and that she can see that now. But the other problem is that his father's machine is apparently in the hands of these shady individuals that run this cabal that we heard about last issue. Dex is in for a chilling encounter next issue, because that's where the issue ends. It's a real depressing ending. It's actually a really good issue. I was surprised. Larry Wachowski's doing a real good job here. It's not James Robinson good, but it's actually not a bad story. So this was a pretty good issue. Issue 7 was pretty good. I thought this one's not bad either. It's $50 dollar read. It's not something you want to pay more than $1 or $2 for. I think $2 is probably a little too high even, but it might be worth $1 to pick it up, check it out. It's a pretty decent story. They were just finding their stride with some of these books when the end came. I think Ectokid's probably the strongest one. Saint Sinner was pretty well a flaming pile of garbage, but I think that was more try-hard stuff than anything else. They were just trying to be more than what they were. Ectokid seemed to be doing okay. I think it's just kind of a mediocre book, but overall it's not the worst thing I've ever read. It's certainly not, new Marvel, but it's not too bad. This one was okay. So yeah, I would give it a mild recommendation. Like, if you happen to stumble across it and it's real cheap, pick up 7 and 8, because it's a pretty decent story between the two issues. Otherwise, the art's not bad. It's same sort of art. It's pencils by Steve Scroce, which kind of works for the book, and I can see some improvement actually from the first couple issues they did. I'm going to give this one a light recommendation. Like I said, if you find it cheap, pick it up. Otherwise, I won't hunt it down or anything. But that'll do it for this episode. As always, thank you so much for listening and supporting the channel. And be sure and come back for another video very soon. Hello and welcome to another Bad Comic Review. This time we are looking at Ectokid issue 9. This is the final issue of the series, and of course this is part of the Razorline series, which was characters created by Clive Barker. This is an interesting issue because it's the last one, but I don't think they knew that it was going to be the last one. Not initially anyway. There is a bit of a change of pace for this one, and they're leading in a new direction, but it doesn't have the feel of a final issue. This is written by Larry Wachowski, pencils by Steve Scroce, Strangeland and Dvorak inkers. Tom DeFalco was the editor-in-chief. I can't read the name of the letterer, and then Mike Thomas was the colorist. So this is back when Marvel was kind of on the rocks. They weren't doing real well financially, and these books were expensive to produce. It had $1.95 cover price. It was on nicer paper. You would expect it to be top-tier quality. Well, the Razorline series was pretty disappointing in that respect. This issue was actually really, really good. Now, in this issue, we jump around a lot because that's the way the story needs to be told. But what happens is a man walks into a bar, pulls a gun out, and is going to shoot Dex. And we jump back in time and learn that this woman, Annabelle, came to hire Dex, and he agrees because I think he needs the money more than anything. Well, then Dex is confronted by this gunman. His name is Mark, and Dex beats the crap out of him with, after he gets sucker punched, by the way, with an ecto sling and knocks the guy out. And the fight scene is actually pretty good. It goes for a few pages, and Dex has to he's still kind of a jerk at this point. Now, then we cut forward to the gun being fired at the bar. Then we go back 6 hours, and we get really the main crux of the story. This Annabelle woman is hiring him because she is still having these dreams that her late husband Patrick is with her. So Dex has to switch his eye patch over and see into the Ectoshphere where this guy is. And he apparently had killed himself, and he can't get rid of the bullet wound because she keeps reliving it. And she's got the bullet under her pillow, which is super creepy. Then we see that Dex is able to kind of console her and say, look, you need to move on so he can move on. So she gets rid of the bullet. So they go down to get a drink at the bar, and that's when Mark comes in, takes a shot at Dex, but Annabelle gets in the way, takes the bullet for him, sacrifices herself to save Dex, and Dex has been a self-centered jerk this whole time, and Mark doesn't know what he's done. He runs over to Annabelle, and Dex decides that he needs to make the most of his second chance. He sees her spirit going away, and he realizes that he has the chance and the power to be more than he is, and to live for more than just himself, and he wants to make the most of his second chance. And that actually is a lot of character development in one issue. It's a solid issue, it's a decent standalone story, and it really progresses the character. So I actually really like this issue. It's probably the best one that Larry Wachowski did, and maybe one of the best ones in the series. And I think they really could have done something with a character like this, but it really didn't go anywhere because Razorline wasn't doing that well, and the series just abruptly ends. At least there was kind of a one-shot wrap-up story to kind of give the character some further motivation if they could bring him back later. I know there is a one-shot they did a year after this, roughly, where it was Ectokid Unleashed. We're going to look at that one later down the line, but I would definitely recommend this issue. I thought it was fun, and you can find these real cheap. I think the most I've ever seen any of the Razorline books go for was about $2, but you should be able to find it in a 50-cent bid. If you do read it, it was a good issue. It doesn't explain a whole lot about his powers, but it was a good standalone story. But that'll do it for this one. As always, thank you so much for listening and supporting the channel. Please hit like and subscribe, and we hope to see you on the next one.